Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where in the world this finds you. I'm Professor Adrian Saville and Director of the Center for African Management and Markets at GIBS. And it's my pleasure and privilege to host Victor Kgomoeswana this afternoon, this morning, this evening, to stay with the theme, to talk about his new book, Africa Bounces Back. If I look at the guests attending this call, Victor needs absolutely no introduction. You will be familiar, aware of his background, his experience, his contributions to thinking. For the sake of completeness, a short intro bio of Victor. Victor Kgomoeswana is a writer, speaker, broadcaster, an expert on business in Africa. He's consulted for multinational companies and been a guest speaker at some of, I'll change your wording there, Victor, to many of Africa's key business conferences. He's an accomplished columnist and he contributes regularly in such commentary to African business, economics, and landscape. Our paths have crossed on many occasions, Victor, and I'm reminded of our late night conversations on your radio show, debating, deliberating, infrastructure investment, Chinese trade, growth prospects, commodity booms, commodity busts across the more than 50 countries that make up the continent. Your initial contribution to this debate was about, or was a deliberation, as to whether Africa was open for business, or perhaps a statement, an assertion that Africa is open for business. And that was your 2014 best-selling book. That came to a rather sudden and unplanned halt when the Open for Business was shut down with the impacts and effects of COVID in 2020. And perhaps that's the place to start, is before we delve into the cases that make up Africa Bounces Back, perhaps we can just rewind a little bit and go to your thesis in your 2014 book. What was the assertion there, and to what extent has that proposal been realized, or hypothesis been realized? And with that question, a very formal welcome to you and to the guests.
Thank you, Professor, and I thank you and your team there at GIBS. I appreciate your audience and an opportunity to talk about a subject that has become my evangelism now. It is no longer about thesis, hypothesis, because in this territory I would not be able to hold a candle. But the Africa is open for business was my way of summing up the way I saw the scenario that faces Africa as a member of the global economic order. So people talk about Asia, they talk about South America, sometimes they talk about North America, sometimes they talk about, but when they talk about Africa, suddenly it's just a place where everybody goes hunting and they go for music and they go for safari, but it was never associated with business, which was tragic, because then lots of businesses were capitalizing on the market, whether it was the billion Africans, whether it was the climate, the long coastline, or the mineral resources that we have in abundance and will continue to have in abundance. They were selling us their consumer products. So when I said it's open for business, I was trying to say the upside of Africa as an investment destination is undisputed. It still is. Secondly, if your mindset is right, it is open to you and your business to trade, to build whatever, because it offers the longest upside compared to any other region, including the emerging markets. Whether you look at China or India, and I'm saying China or India because both those countries have a population larger than Africa, each of them. And Africa, because it's 55 states, you then get confused. That's what you're dealing with. But real business people know that eventually it's the billion people on one continent that will appeal to their products. So I was saying it's open for anybody who has the right attitude And that's why at the end, I have the 10-point checklist, which is called Think, Talk, Walk African. It was 10 points of suggesting how people who wanted to take advantage of the upside of Africa should do, the things they should or should not do. In other words, summing up the kind of demeanor that will work in your favor on a sustainable basis if you're a business.
Now, when I take my mind back to the contents, the argument, the contribution of that work, Africa being open for business has the suggestion or the hint of, well, come and see what you can do here. But this wasn't the thesis at all. This was a recognition that businesses built and grown domestically. Paul Kagame references the great extractions or excavations of Africa, speaking about the wave of colonization, the wave of multilateralism, the wave of funding and institutional occupation, perhaps invasion might be a more assertive word. And so there's no suggestion or hint in this that open for business as well, we're throwing our arms wide open, come and do what you want.
No, it's not up for grabs at all. In fact, knowing the colonial history of Africa or what has happened to Africa, it had come from that era where everybody, you remember the scramble for Africa, and now we are talking another scramble for Africa. Is because the mindset, mistakenly and tragically, is that Africa is there for the taking. It is not. And companies that have tried that are beginning to learn very bitter lessons. Whether you're talking about acacia mines in Tanzania, or you're talking about companies that you talked about, Rwanda. And I mean, there's a South African company that went to Rwanda to build an hotel around 94, 95. And they came to the end of the year, June 16 in South Africa, we shut down, and then December 16, we almost shut down the year. And they did that and closed, but the government of Rwanda had wanted to open that hotel in April the following year, in time for the commemoration of the genocide and they closed, and the government went to the scene, removed whoever was there and started completing the hotel themselves. When the company went back, they were told, no, sorry, we had to finish the hotel because you never told us that when you build, you're going to close on December 16th. We wanted you to hand over the keys the end of January, and you never told us that. So what I'm saying is, often people get taken aback and shocked because they go into the continent thinking we still have the docile Africans who are just happy to take instructions. And yet you're talking Nigeria today. I mean, there is a 650,000 barrel refinery that's kicking off, built by Africa's richest man, Dangote. And he has got so many refineries scrambling, not sure what to do, because they are saying there's no way somebody who can refine that much and is going to produce $103 million liters of fuel, which is when Nigeria needs about 60 million a year. There's no point going up against it. Now think about it. Would you have imagined that multinationals would have been thinking twice before taking on an African industrialist like Dangote? So things have changed. And when you come into the continent, you need to have respect. You need to be humble. You need to think sharing. You need to think give and take. And you have to think indigenization. So don't build an empire the way the traditional empires were built. Find a way of localizing both the ownership, the supply chain, and the value chain as it is, to make sure that people identify with your entity as one of their own.
And what your frame of reference there suggests to me is this could be an entirely different scramble for Africa in a far more constructive and a far more engaging way, as opposed to grabbing what we can get. The earlier on,
I think, Prof. Seville, this is what you are teaching and very well so at universities and MBA level. You are teaching leaders who can think ESG. So sustainability must be at the heart of everything you do. So if you go with a grabbing mentality, you are reminding people of slave trade, of colonial oppression. There's no way you're going to build a brand as a business leader or as a business using that approach. So it must be a sustainable triple bottom line sustainability thinking that precedes or underlies everything that you do.
So Victor, before we delve into the cases in your book, I want to invite our guests on this call to put questions, comments, challenges, agreement, disagreement. Please interrupt us. This is a conversation as opposed to one-way traffic, and it would be, I would welcome your questions, comments, thoughts as we go along. Just before we get to the actual cases in Africa Bounces Back, I've got two questions for you, Victor. The first is the open for business. To what extent did COVID disrupt or interrupt that thesis? Has that thesis changed?
No, it hasn't changed, but it has taught us. What COVID has taught us is that our lives can be disrupted in an instant. But what that does is, if you are disrupted in an instant and all you were counting on, and I'll use tourism as a mega industry in Africa, and your tourism was only based on international travelers from outside of Africa, then you have a problem. Therefore, COVID has taught us, and I'm sure the people of Cape Town will have learned the bitter lesson here, that you price your establishments for people paying in dollars, you marginalize your local or domestic market. The chapter on tourism talks about how a domestic tourism in Africa bounces back, how domestic travelers spend a lot more in the end than international travelers. But because we are so focused on getting international travelers, sometimes we forget. So what COVID has taught us is, hey, you can be disrupted. Therefore, don't just count on international travel, physical movement. Secondly, it has highlighted what we had already been talking about, that healthcare is a major driver of economic prosperity. There's no economy that can really be an economic success when access to healthcare is compromised. So if you look at how we are frustrated now because we don't have enough vaccines and we are waiting for the Western world to give us vaccines when we could have been manufacturing vaccines ourselves. If you look at the fact that we were importing gloves and masks and sanitizers, when I remember there was a university in the Eastern Cape that said last year already, they had enough capacity to manufacture sanitizers. If you look at the fact that we're buying computers out of China, when we have in the Eastern Cape a manufacturer of tablets, we have in KZN a manufacturer of smartphones. Just that, what it has done is learn a bit more self-reliance. And you'll know about the history of South Africa, Prof. Saville, that during the apartheid era, the isolation of South Africa forced it to innovate so much that you might still say some of the best innovations and industrial advancements came from that time when we were isolated. So although it's a bad thing, this COVID, and it's a disruptor of business flow, it has taught us that we must be a lot more self-reliant, which couldn't have come at a better time for people like us. Because that's what I've been complaining about, that before you sell anything to the outside world, make sure you sell to the domestic world. You think that's gobbledygook? Hollywood is a small section of Los Angeles, but it has managed, because of the Oscars, to dictate the films that the rest of the world can watch. So less than 2,000 people sit down every year, they rank the movies, they sell their movies in Hollywood to the 300 million Americans. When they bring it to us, they say, oh, it's an Oscar-winning movie. So it's a lot easier to sell something to the outside world when it has made a success locally.
That's a powerful point. Keketso's got some questions, which I'll come to in a second. I promised two questions before we get to the cases. So my second question is, you've called your book Africa Bounces Back. Are you sure we should be trying to bounce back? Or is this not about building to something different, or where have we fallen from? What's the reference there? What are we trying to get back to?
It's, if you look at the title, it's Africa Bounces Back, and then it's case studies from a resilient continent. So that word resilient is the active ingredient of this story in the 31 chapters in this book, plus the contribution by Tebi Kalafem on African Brand. So after every disruption, you know, we had a rugby match on Saturday, didn't we? Where we were fighting from behind every time. So it's that bouncing back of South Africans, of Nigerians, of Kenyans, that even after you've been disrupted, because we have been disrupted, and there are certain things, not only COVID, by the way, the price of commodities globally was not always favoring us. There was a time when we had the boom, and some of the countries like South Africa missed out on it. There was a time when tourism was just flying out of control and it got disrupted. So the essence of it is it will be bouncing back from disruption, just like it bounced back from colonial oppression, just it bounced back from civil wars, it bounced back from slave trade. So it's almost appealing to the quintessential African in all of us, that remember we have the resilience, we are made of that stock. When we say in Afrikaans, a bull market plan, we're not talking about only Afrikaans-speaking people or farmers. We're talking about every African that faced with hostility, with adversity, with shortage, with scarcity, we always find a way to bounce back. So it's appealing to that because there is evidence that we can bounce back, even if COVID were to continue harassing us for the next 2 to 3 years.
There's some important work done by Morton Jervin, the academic economist, who shows that for much of the last 50 or 60 years, as the wave of independence swept through Africa, Africa is paraded or presented as the dark continent, the hopeless continent, that the place where dreams are dashed and opportunity is lost or squandered. But Morton Jervin's work I find particularly fascinating because what he demonstrates is that the 1960s and 70s overwhelmingly was a successful period for the continent at large. And since the last part of the 1990s to present, Africa is the second fastest growing region in the world. So in fact, that really leaves the 1980s and into the 90s, which was a massive commodity price disruption that becomes an important explainer of this interruption of what could otherwise have been a very successful and substantial transition. Now, the fact
not only that, the 80s were a very important era in the history of the world because that's when the Berlin Wall fell.
Yeah.
That's when the Cold War proved to be a losing proposition. And what I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and we were looking to Russia as the supporter of the struggle against apartheid. Come the late 80s, and suddenly there was talk of glasnost and perestroika. So the Cold War literally just ended on us in the middle
and
of
the wall was gone and the curtain was lifted.
Exactly. The countries like Angola, the DRC, where there had been sides of the West versus the East. So the Cold War was actually being fought in Africa. And what happened? We suddenly found ourselves as those pawns in a chess game where somebody has surrendered or the big guns have made peace with one another and we are irrelevant. And of course, apartheid ended, which disrupted the channeling of resources, donor aid or donor funding to Africa through South Africa. And suddenly we had to be on inward looking when we had. So you are right, there was a disruption, but let's not forget that the world itself figured out that there was no sense to Cold War. And they were beginning to appreciate that China was overtaking the West and whatever at any rate. So they started having to work together now to counter that rising tide of Chinese and Indian dominance.
Right. Now, in your book, you have 31 chapters plus a closing chapter by guest. In none of those chapters, you square up explicitly to the single currency question that Keketso has put here. But this is an open forum. We get to ask you as many questions as we like.
Yes.
So let's draw on Keketso's first questions. You do devote important space and attention to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which establishes the largest free trade area by population and by number of countries. Of course, the economy is still small, but by headcount and by member countries, it is unprecedented. So those two opening questions.
Yes.
To what extent has COVID interrupted the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was launched at the beginning of this year, or which was manifested at the beginning of this year? And in that context, is it possible for Africa to have a single currency?
It will eventually have a single currency. Remember, currency is not currency in the sense of the 60s and 50s, where you carried money, put it under your mattress. Now people are already trading. In fact, let me just give you an example. It's not a currency, but last week there was a very important breakthrough where SADC, the Southern African Development Community, with more than 14 countries, managed to transfer money across countries. Remember, originally, when you're transferring money from a money transfer platform like M-Pesa or Puru, whatever, the person you're sending it to in a bank account in another country would have to wait a number of days before the account is cleared. Now, there was an account in Namibia that sent money to Zimbabwe to see if it can be cleared in a matter of seconds, the way we expect it to. Now, it's not a single currency, but remember, currency is the language of trade. So as long as we agree on what value we are exchanging, I'm giving you the book, you give me something. As long as there's a correspondence, alignment of value, interpretation, we are doing business. But the currency in Africa will eventually happen when the different regional economic blocks have worked amongst themselves what their currency is. SADC is going to take a while before it has a single currency. But Economic Community of West African States, an additional 15-country member bloc, where the largest economy, Nigeria, is, and among the fastest growing in China, in Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. That region is going to have, they have decided on the ECO, the one unit. So if they get the one unit for Economic Community of West Africa and they teach the CFA, which was linking them to France unnecessarily, then we at least have 15 countries with one currency. Then East African Community is likely to follow suit, and maybe SADC will have done something by that time. But it's when the banks are speaking to one another, the payment systems are aligned, that even if we don't have a single currency, we have the same language, the medium of exchange, even though it's not called a currency. So it will eventually happen, because otherwise, what's the point? But remember, we are fighting a lot of colonial hangover here, where people think having a currency called Emalangeni, or a currency called a rand, or Dalasi in Gambia, or is a symbol of prestige. Eventually, the trading across borders, the online trading, the African Continental Free Trade Area will force people to think value, not labels or tags.
So in this regard, I mean, what I'm hearing you suggest or infer is that as 55 countries, we could come together at some point. You're not putting a timeline on it. That makes it a good economic forecast. You say an event or a date, but never both. We could learn or borrow from the West African franc, the CFA franc, or the Central African CFA franc. Often confused. These are two different currencies, both backed by the French currency, French treasury, but you've got 8 member states making up the West African franc. You've got 6 Central African states making up the Central African franc. Those two, in and of themselves, facilitate substantial ease of transaction cross-border. Recently, there's been a move to harmonize those currencies and replace that with local origin.
Yes.
So there's much more that can be done on that front, and that would be one tool or one aspect that would facilitate integration in African economic connectedness. Of course. So let's go to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Of course, that is the big policy initiative that sits behind all of this. What's the prospect for that?
It is a challenge that we must accept, because remember the small-mindedness that comes with thinking I'm the head of state and therefore I'm entitled to levy taxes on all kinds of things coming in. I'm entitled to charge people a visa fee for them to apply. Those things are the, shall I say, the hangovers of where we've come from. So we are looking at, some countries will do better than others. So some countries will open borders quicker, like I mentioned.
Such as?
Yeah.
Give me an example.
Okay. Again, let's use, Zimbabwe has a border between itself and Zambia, for example. So the northern parts of Zimbabwe, or the southern parts of the Chirundu border post. That border post has been around for nearly 10 years already. It's a one-stop border post. The work that is being done in Messina now, at the Bay Bridge, to make sure that you have 7 or 8 lanes, allowing trucks to move much faster and also move towards a border post. You have the Maputo Logistics Corridor Initiative. It has these problems, but it is going in the right direction in the bigger scheme of things. Rwanda, I think, has about 6 one-stop border posts with the countries that surround it already. So there are countries that have accelerated, especially the landlocked ones, because they are forced to do trade with one another. So Ethiopia, if you think about it, Ethiopia and Djibouti and Eritrea have started working together with Somalia in the Horn of Africa. So you're going to find that regions where people are moving more freely will become bigger and bigger trade zones. And if you take an Ethiopia with 100 million people plus, it can become a quasi-regional economic bloc. And if it joins the East African community, now suddenly you have a small region of less than 10 countries, but with an economy, a market, a population of more than 400 million people. That can challenge ECOWAS, even though ECOWAS has a lot more countries. So it's not going to happen at once. It's going to happen in small zones, which is a good thing, because it's better to create small regions and then amalgamate regions that are already aligned themselves. But let's not forget, e-commerce will sort out any laggard that's out there refusing.
Okay, wait. Before you go to the e-commerce, could you agree, or would you agree then, that if it is regionalism before Pan-Africanism, could it be argued that the East African community has led the way in regional integration?
It has led the way, yes, it has. Let me simplify it. It has, because the countries, the major countries, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, and Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, had a lot more alignment. They had been working together. The language they spoke had more commonality. They spoke English and mainly Kiswahili. So it was very easy to communicate, which is why maybe Kiswahili is the language of the African Union as well, because they have led the way. If it hadn't been for the 2008 global credit crunch, they would have a common currency by now, because they had been working on it.
Wow. Okay, so I stopped you in you were about to make a comment on e-commerce. We're back with Kgomoeswana, who is winning the Olympic medal. So far, Kgomoeswana has the gold, silver, and bronze in question asking. So the third question, I sincerely hope my humor travels. Please pop questions here, guys. The question is, with the scale of Africa and incorporating the free trade agreement, is it not possible, using technology, AI, etc., to have an African Alibaba? A platform to trade textiles, clothing, smartphones, car parts, solar products, etc.
Yeah. We actually already have those. There are so many. It's just that you mentioned Alibaba. The larger economies, the Western economies, are much smarter and a lot more deliberate in promoting their solutions. So there is an African Netflix, but we know Netflix. There's an African Zoom, but we know Zoom. So, and that's where the mentality has to be right, that when we have solutions in Africa, we must embrace them. So you go to Nigeria, you'll find a young man called Tayo Aviosu, who started a company called Paga. It's a payment systems company. It's got tens of millions of customers already. And if you look at it, it can replace a whole lot of payment systems. In fact, there's a chapter in this book, Africa bounces back dedicated to fintech, to just cite as many examples as I could get into a single chapter that are of an African nature. So yes, we can. I mean, think about it this way. GPS is an American system owned by the American Army. The Russians don't use GPS. The Chinese don't use GPS. They have their own GPS, if you know what I mean. So there's no reason why Africans cannot have their own GPS, cannot have their own, what is it called, EMC squared in the Atlantic, their own servers under the sea, so that we store our information not in Palo Alto terms, but we store them in terms of an African server. Those things can be done because we have our own ZXCR here, which is a registry company. Therefore, we can create an e-commerce platform, get people to register domain names, embrace the .Africa domain name, which is already there, and it's embraced by ICANN. So we can have an Alibaba. We do have it in its embryonic stages, just like we have the Mara phones that are made in South Africa by an African company, but most of us are still using Huawei and iPhones. So the mindset has to change so that we understand we already have these solutions. We just have to embrace them somehow.
And Melvin makes the point about e-commerce players such as Jumia as being a case in point. I think that you were alluding to that.
No, I agree with that.
Matema Matle says, what are your views on corruption in Africa and the impact on business development?
Yeah, corruption is a big problem, but upfront I've got to say it's not an African concept, and it's important because when Silvio Berlusconi, the former owner of Juventus Club and former Prime Minister of Italy, gets arraigned on charges of corruption, people don't say, you see, typical Italian. But when it's a corruption case in Africa, it's typical African. Secondly, a corruption is an equation. Where there is somebody who's corrupt as in taking a bribe, there's somebody willing to pay the bribe. In my book, a mathematical equation has an equal to sign in between, which means what's on the left-hand side is equal to what's on the right-hand side. Therefore, when we say corrupt African politicians, let's remember they kept that money in Swiss banks. So if Switzerland wants to be the advanced economy of the world and the seat of civilization, then they must accept that they have abetted corruption at the same time. But what's my point? We can't license corruption, whatever the reason, whatever the configuration. Therefore, for us as Africans, we have to decide we are not up for sale, number one. Number two, we are not as cheap as the bribes that are being paid. So when we see the state capture in South Africa, we should accept and refuse that we are not worth the small pennies changed in Saxon world. We're a lot more, we are worth a lot more. But how do we get it right? We have to strengthen institutions, and we have to get young people taking interest in politics, Professor. We can't talk about corruption because it's perpetrated by corrupt politicians who are relying on corrupt business people to pay the bribe. But of course, governance can always be on the rise. South Africa is a good example that you can be on a downward slope and turn as long as institutions are still in place and they are strengthened more and more. So we have to understand the cost of it, that is depriving poor people access to education, healthcare, security or protection services, and we should fight it with the same vigor that we are fighting COVID.
What I love in this conversation is the depth and breadth of the stories and arguments and ideas that you're sharing. And to this audience, you're well known as a world-class narrator. So I want you to tell us your favorite story from Africa Bounces Back. What's the one that one of these chapters is your golden chapter? Which one is it?
Oh, okay, you're asking a father to choose his favorite child. Okay.
Well, maybe I should tell you mine. Shall we do show and tell? And I'll tell you mine, and and perhaps why. It's one of your early chapters on the debate as to whether Africa. Well, a lot of our work in the Center for African Management and Markets is about how we build, how we establish networks, how we achieve connectedness, the power of community, and then translating that from ideas into action. And I think that that's an aspect that GIBS as a business school, really prides itself in, is that it's a school that is close to business. And in your chapter 2, you talk about the tussle or the wrestle, China versus the United States.
Yeah.
And the story that you tell, when you look at this, at first blush, it's, well, who's going to win the war?
Yeah.
Will it be China or the United States? And you turn this thing on its head, you've got a completely different argument.
Yeah. Yeah, the title is almost tongue-in-cheek. It says, here's China versus the US, choose sides.
Yeah.
But my real proposition is, no, don't choose sides. And if you're choosing sides, choose Africa. Because China is not fighting US so that they can promote Africa. They are fighting to promote Chinese interests, but they are using us. And you saw it in the Huawei. I enjoyed writing the chapter, as I enjoyed the one between the UK versus France. Again, it's a European country fighting another European country, but Africa is in top. But the chapter, if you want, you force me, you push me to choose, I think the chapter about Ethiopian Airlines is one of them that makes me really excited. But because it's a real good example of what bouncing back means, that here is an airline that 10 years ago was not known by many people. Today, if you say you're flying in Africa and you don't know Ethiopian Airlines, or you're flying to Africa and you don't know Ethiopian Airlines, you're a fake. Especially because it's 100% owned by the government of Ethiopia. So if there's no private sector participation at all, but they managed to build an airline that's most successful. Even in 2020, it was still profitable. And it has managed to own hotels around the airport, which has now become the gateway in terms of the traffic flow in there, replacing Dubai. So that is just one story that makes me proud to be African. And then there is a chapter about...
Hang on, wait. Before you run there, I just want to sort of boast some data on this conversation. So Ethiopian Airlines 10 years ago carried 2 million passengers in the year 2012. Ethiopian Airlines in 2019 carried 12 million passengers. So that's a 6-fold increase in passenger carry in the space of a decade over the same 10 years. And this is not a South African conversation, this is an African conversation. But over the same 10 years, South African SAA, which was the biggest African carrier, went from 8 million passengers to 5 million, 6 million, 5 million. We were,
and a few vials of vaccine,
And then in 2020, there was all of this word, the word that became alongside "Can you see me? Can you hear me?" It was pivot. Everyone was pivoting, and lots of talk about pivoting. But a business that pivoted was Ethiopian Airlines, that pulled out all of their passenger seats and turned themselves into cargo carriers.
Exactly. In fact, before they even turned, they refused to cancel flights, and they refused to cancel flights to China. And here's where that was a smart move. They said, we are obeying all the requirements of the World Health Organization when we fly people. But what people don't realize is we have Ethiopian Airlines to thank, because there were many people stuck in China who wanted to come back home. The only flight they could get on was Ethiopian Airlines. Okay, they would have transmitted a few cases of COVID, because every time you fly across borders, you pose the risk of that. But then you are right. Then they realized, we have all these aircraft, we are not going to sit. What does the world need? If people can't fly, they need COVID vaccines, they need masks. And China, if you remember, was saying, we're going to provide so many doses of this, we're going to give you so many masks. Alibaba chairman Jack Ma was saying, I am donating so many kits of PPE. And so it became a cargo airline. And of course, as time went by, there was still trade. People were moving. You mentioned, we are now, can you see me, can you hear me, unmute yourself. They started moving more computers from China into the rest of the world. So they become cargo aircraft almost overnight. And that, for a government-owned entity, is a masterstroke. If you consider how long we take here in South Africa to make a decision about South African Airways.
France Sese Dinyani says, Bravik, when are you launching the book publicly?
Okay, I will say this. This is part of the public launch, and I always have to be thankful. I have to be thankful to GIBS, because even in the first, okay, but I will tell you, people must just watch my social media. I'm going to start doing a meet the author kind of, but I need to wait for September because it will be warmer. We will have more people vaccinated, and we will be more, the lockdown levels will have been loosened a bit. I want to do it safely, so I'm going to do it in clutches of 100. There are restaurants that have said they are willing to host it. So the first one, if I may just say, will be happening in Modderfontein. Look out for look at my social media. I'll be there on the 9th of September. So, but this is part of the public launch. That's why we are talking to you on this. Yeah, it's no longer going to be the good old fashioned, let's all gather in one hall. Because Africa is open for business. I launched at the Central Convention Center. It was a full house, and we had lots of people there. I don't think we are going back there soon.
That was in the olden days, hey?
I don't think we will. But there will be a FaceTime with the author. The first one, as I mentioned, being on the 9th of September at a restaurant in Modderfontein called Gratitude. But just watch social media. I'll advertise.
Tsepiso, I think that answers your question also. So Victor, we're not going to get away from Ethiopia just yet. A question from Joseph and a note from me. The note from me is this extraordinary story of Ethiopian Airlines. They're building this massive airport, 100 million passengers. That's the equivalent of Heathrow. Being built in just outside of Addis. It's an extraordinary number.
Exactly, and they're just showing you something. So they're saying to you, we already have Bole International Airport in Addis Ababa, but because Ethiopian Airlines flies to all these destinations, I have flown through that airline. It's not always the most comfortable because the traffic is just too much. So I think what they're saying is, number one, it's just like in South Africa, we have in a good way we have Cape Town International Airport, we have Durban International Airport, we have OR Tambo, but we also have, what is the airline called in Lanseria? Those are international airports in their own right. So if you're flying from the West African coast, you might just, and you're going to the Western Cape, why not land in Cape Town? So it gives that option, but it just shows you how bullish they are with regard to the aviation. They know eventually we will never stop flying, and if we stop flying, we will never stop transporting cargo. So they know they're if it hadn't been for COVID, because now COVID disrupted travel and it dropped aviation by 80% or so globally. So the financiers would have been a little nervous about putting money into an airport like that, but they are doing it. Another country that's building a bigger airline is Rwanda, which is, I think, is in Bugesera. So the countries are beginning to say, we don't just need one massive airline, we need many airlines. But here in South Africa, we can relate to it because we have exactly the same arrangement.
So that was the easy one on Ethiopia. Now you've got a much tougher one. Joseph Biamugisha says, Ethiopia was certainly an exciting prospect, but I would argue that the decision by Abiy Ahmed Ali to fight against the TPLF in Tigray will have dire consequences for the Horn of Africa. What's your opinion?
It has dire consequences. It has dire consequences, but let's understand that one of the problems of Ethiopia is TPLF, and I'm not saying it as in the party is a problem. Just let's remind people that Ethiopia is not governed by one party. It was governed by a coalition of parties. So TPLF was the party of Meles Zenawi, and it had grown accustomed to ruling the country, at least since 1991 or so. So because Meles Zenawi was a very strong leader, I liked him, he did a lot of good for that country. But unfortunately, there's this ruling elite that when the order changes, so you have an Oromo man coming in Abiy Ahmed, who's coming from an ethnic group that was already threatening to break away from the country, not just the ruling coalition. So that ethnicity has become a serious problem. It's not the only country. Kenya, south of Ethiopia, has a similar problem, where sometimes it's difficult for people to have a decent political discussion, because we will say, and this, and they'll say, but this Kikuyu people, and then they'll say this Luo people. So I'm saying, yes, let's not be tempted to comment too much about it from outside, because those are internal politics. That's internal politics. Remember that what he did, Abiy Ahmed, he said, I'm doing away with the coalition. I'm creating one party prosperity. The TPLF people said, not a chance, because that was an acknowledgement on this Oromo man from Oromia who was saying, now we are doing away with the chance that you are likely to dominate on the basis of your ethnicity. So overall, Ethiopia is not going down the tubes, if we like to say. It will remain an attractive destination for investment. Abiy Ahmed will remain a strong leader, but yes, how he's handling the Tigrayan crisis will be, if you like, the fly in his oil.
To our guests, thank you for your questions and comments. There's some lovely stuff going on in the chat and in the Q&A. So please keep posting here. Victor, I want to take you back to West Africa, where very often when business conversations turn to West Africa, it is invariably, it's a conversation about Nigeria. Sometimes it might sort of stutter a couple of countries to the left and go to Ghana. But it's not often that Côte d'Ivoire is singled out as a extraordinary prospect. Now, in our work at the center, we have a 6-factor model in which we identify ingredients that contribute to sustained, elevated, inclusive growth. We identify Côte d'Ivoire as a real country prospect, as a standout prospect. Yes. You call the country the prodigal son.
Yes, and by the way, your 6-pack, Prof. Savo, I must give you, you were very modest today. You didn't acknowledge that it's referenced in the book as well. So your students, if they don't mind buying the book so they can know that their professor is already at that level of being. I call it the prodigal son because Côte d'Ivoire was one of the most successful countries in the world, not just in Africa. When they gained independence in 1960, Felix Houphouët-Boigny was a real Nelson Mandela by 3. And he was a respected man, but obviously he had his own politics. Some people questioned him, and I did question him, but he managed to build what you can call a prosperous country. Unfortunately, he held on a little too long, and the old man, as they say, when he died, he left the country in disarray. And the country wasn't able to hold it together for a very long time. They started questioning who is Ivorian, who's not. They started, I remember Didier Drogba going at a match in Sudan and crying on television after winning the match, begging the people of Côte d'Ivoire to stop fighting. And he made an impact because for the first time, I think they took a match from the south to the north of the country, something that politicians could not do. Now you had the story of Alassane Ouattara coming in to replace Laurent Gbagbo. Again, there's a controversy. It's more like removing Muammar Gaddafi. But in the end, what you're having in that country is a country that had so much and it squandered it, because this is the largest producer of cocoa in the world. And alongside Ghana, contributes to more than 60% of the cocoa, which means if you love chocolate, 6 out of 10, you have to bow and say, thank you, Côte d'Ivoire, thank you, Ghana. Now, for them to have something that great and have had such a leader in as early as 1960 and just squander so much, they are the prodigal son. But what did the prodigal son do? The prodigal son learned the lesson and went back, and he was accepted into the fold. So Côte d'Ivoire is being accepted, including the fact that the African Development Bank, the premier development finance institution, has gone back to the headquarters there, which means they put the country on the map. A South African company invested, as you know, led a group of investors to build the equivalent of the Gilulis flyover, the interchange in a bridge named after Bedi. And you have all these investments. And of course, 2 years ago, the government of Côte d'Ivoire decided alongside Ghana to hold on to their cocoa production until they manage to get fair trade for their farmers. And on top of that, they are building chocolate factories. So it's a prodigal son in the sense that it has learned its lesson. It's, remember, the key entry point for France, because it speaks French. And the reason people don't talk about it, of course, I must say, is people like myself. Because I don't speak French, I end up not speaking as much about the French-speaking countries because I have to read English press to know what's happening. Whereas if I spoke French, I would have spoken about them a lot more. And that's the myth that we must do away with, that you can't do business in a French-speaking country if you don't speak the language. I've been to Cote d'Ivoire many times. I've been to Gabon. These countries speak French. You can do business in English. So let's not look away from them. But particularly Cote d'Ivoire is a prodigal son because it squandered chances, more like South Africa, and is making a comeback now, a very strong comeback, I must say.
So on that note, Victor, we've probably got time for just one last debate or deliberation. You're talking about Cote d'Ivoire doing business in Francophone Africa. So I'm going to take you to what you call the center of the universe, the DRC.
Yes.
Another French-speaking country. Some years back, I met with Roger Agnelli, at the time the CEO of Vale, the big Brazilian mining business. Of course, he was very sadly killed in a helicopter accident. But at the time that I met him, he had just started businesses in the DRC. Vale had started businesses in the DRC. And he made sort of a sweeping, some would argue very brusque, uncharitable note that some of the most valuable resources in the world sit in the DRC, but they will always sit there because you might be able to get in, but you can't get out. Tell us what your perspective is on the DRC.
Okay, now I've remembered my favorite chapter is the chapter about the DRC, the center of the universe, because it is the center of the universe, literally and figuratively. So if you draw the equator and where it meets the meridian, then the point where they meet is in the Atlantic Ocean, but not far from the DRC. The land mass of the DRC, you have to fly over the country to get an idea of how vast it is. But most of all, it has the biggest river, if not one of the biggest, which could power the entire African continent with hydroelectricity. It has reserves of gold, diamonds, these are traditional minerals, but also coltan, the modern minerals that go into making the cell phones that we are using and the lithium batteries that we are using to power electrical, any rechargeable battery that you make, you have to thank the DRC for it. And so I'm saying, and then I use an illustration in the book where I just calculate the amount, the GDP in revenue generated in Antwerp, where the world's diamonds exchanges are, where they are processing diamonds from the DRC, and yet they make $54 billion in 1 year in revenue, and the GDP of the DRC is still $48 billion. Just the injustice of that is that's not criminal, it's evil, downright evil. Because what it says is that you and I are talking on a cell phone now. I'm using a cell phone to stream. I'm using the minerals of the DRC to talk to the world, and yet the DRC is still among the poorest. You look at the GDP per capita, it's still one of the poorest. But if you look at the role of the US via the CIA, the role of Belgium, thanks to King Leopold, you realize that we've taken the center of the universe and trashed it. So I'm saying, if we are going to get it right in Africa, there's no way we can get Africa right until we get the DRC right. One, because of the vastness of it, but lastly, because it shares a border with 9 other countries. So if you mess up the DRC, you are messing up 9 other countries. And guess what? All of those 9 countries are in the eastern side, in the southern side, in the western side. So if you mess up the DRC, the north of Africa can be all right, the east can be, the south can be, the west can be. Therefore, that's why I call it the center of the universe. And it just shows you when you talk about continuing exploitation. But I have faith that the new government is beginning to stabilize the region, including making peace with Rwanda, because that's another problematic relationship of neighbors that has always made that region even more difficult.
We've got time for one question that has 3 words in its answer, or 3 statements in its answer. This comes again from Joseph Byamugisha, who says, which 3 countries present the best opportunities for investors post-COVID-19? What are your 3 countries?
I would still say South Africa, if we can get our act together, because we are strategically located and we have a lot of things that we have got. Nigeria, because if you don't have a Nigeria strategy and you are in business, you are irrelevant. And Ethiopia.
You know, Victor, when I started this call, when we started talking almost an hour ago, I said that it was a pleasure and a privilege to host you. I'm going to add one more word, and I'm going to say it's an absolute delight to host you. You are rich in knowledge and insight. What I find invaluable in your contribution to our knowledge and understanding is the case study approach that you bring, that you've understood these countries, these companies, the communities on a case-by-case basis. Tsepo Clive Marema says, kudos on shining the light on the continent amid all of the challenges that lie ahead, and stay blessed. I think those are perfect words for us to finish off this call with you. If this conversation doesn't have people buying your book, I don't know what will.
Thank you for hosting me. I appreciate GIBS. I appreciate you, Prof. Saville, because we need academics who are tied to the real world. It's not good when academics can't link their students to the real world. So I appreciate your contribution as well. But this invitation is how we shine. I'm a storyteller. I can only tell the story until people get it. So thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation.
Keep telling the story to our guests. Thanks for being with us for this hour. To Victor, thank you for giving us your time and for contributing to this important knowledge base.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay well, everyone.